Strabo. I have a law firm here in Louisville, Strabo Barkley PLLC, and we're helping sponsor this event tonight along with the Kentucky Conservation Committee. Yay, Lane Bowman's here. I'm going to list off our other sponsors: Kentucky Solar Energy Society, Louisville Climate Action Network, okay, Kentucky Resources Council, Bellarmine University School of Environmental Studies, and of course Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Church. And I don't think Drew is here. Is Drew Foley here yet?
His back is hurt.
Okay. Or Drew. I'm sorry, Drew. But Drew was very instrumental in helping us get this arranged in the last minute, so I want to thank Drew for that. And also the Cumberland chapter of the Sierra Club and the Louisville group of the Sierra Club. They did some, they helped with this as well. So tonight we're going to hear from Carroll Muffett, and Kate Bulinski is going to moderate it for us. But I think most of you probably know by now, if you looked at the advertisement for this, that Carroll is born and raised in Kentucky. He was born in Owensboro, raised in Hancock County. So it's nice to know that we have great people in DC working for us, other than Scott Pruitt. But I'm going to start with Kate. So Dr. Kate Bulinski, she's an associate professor at Bellarmine University School of Environmental Studies. She has a PhD in geology. She got it from the University of Cincinnati, and her undergraduate degree at Penn State in geosciences. She is also the board president, current board president, right, of Kentucky Interfaith Power and Light. Most of you probably know Tim Darst in that organization. It's a great organization. I work with Kate at Bellarmine. I teach classes at Bellarmine, one class a year, not too many. But she's great with students, and she's a great educator and professional. So everyone, please welcome Kate, our moderator tonight. And now for Carroll Muffett, special guy tonight. Carroll is the CEO and president of the Center for International Environmental Law, CL. We'll let Carroll talk about CL, but prior to that, he was the executive director of the Climate Law and Policy Project. He's worked with Greenpeace USA as their deputy campaigns director, and he was international counsel and senior director for international conservation at Defenders of Wildlife. He graduated from University of Minnesota's Law School and Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He's also a member of IUCN's Commission on Environmental Law, serves on the board of advisors of the Climate Accountability Institute, and the board of editors for the International Journal of Wildlife Law and Policy. So I mentioned this before. What's so great about Carroll is that when people become angry at you that you're from Kentucky and that Scott Pruitt is from Kentucky, you can tell them just piss off. We also have someone here that more than makes up for it. So please everybody welcome Carroll Muffett. So the way this is going to work, Kate's going to basically interview Carroll and have a back and forth that way. And then towards the end, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Okay? With that, thank you all.
Well, first I want to thank you, Carroll, for agreeing to come and speak with us tonight, and thank all of you for coming tonight. So I guess in my role as an educator, I'm always very curious how people kind of come into the profession that they're interested in, because I'm always guiding students into, following their paths. So I want to hear a little bit about your background. So can you tell us a little bit what it was like growing up in Kentucky, and where you went to school, and what your education was like?
Sure, and just apologies to everybody, because I do a lot of speaking, but I'm used to talking about work, and I'm not used to talking about me, so we'll see how it goes. So I grew up, like Randy said, I was born in Owensboro, but really grew up my whole life in Hancock County. I went to South Hancock Elementary School, and then I went to Hancock County High School. And when I was 11 years old, I was watching Three's Company, and I'd always known that I was interested in world history, and I wanted to be a lawyer because Michael wanted to be a lawyer on Good Times, so I wanted to be a lawyer because he was going to be a lawyer. And I was watching, but I didn't know how to combine world history and being a lawyer. And I was watching Three's Company at 11, and Jack Tripper's brother came on, and he said, "I make $200,000 a year because I'm an international law, you're like, those words together were enough for me, and I sort of never looked back.
Great. So what was your early education like in Hancock County? Did you get, what kinds of formative experiences did you have?
Well, here's the crazy thing about Hancock County, and I didn't realize, I didn't realize it until I was in D.C. and realized like D.C. doesn't have a gifted program for 40 years later, but we were sort of lucky in that Hancock County 40 years ago had gifted and talented programs, and so I got to do things like study business law in 7th grade and take classes like that, and it was a standard weird growing up way out in the country sort of childhood, and I think one of the things that really led me to being an environmentalist, a lifelong environmentalist, and is that the woods were my best friends when I was growing up. It's where I went for peace. It's where I went just to be with myself. It was the only place where I was really me, was just out walking alone in the woods. And I had my family, they hunted, they fished, and just sort of being out in the peace and the quiet is sort of part of you. And one of the things I've tried to explain to people about Kentucky, because and you see it in other places, but you don't really see it in cities, is that if you're from here, it sort of runs in your blood, and when you're not in Kentucky, you feel it as an absence. And people who only grow up in cities, only grow up on the coast, they really don't get that connection to place. And one of the great things about being from Kentucky is I go to islands in the Bering Sea where people have lived there 10,000 years, or I go to communities in the Masai Mara, and those people, they get me because they're the same way. They're tied to the land, they're tied to the sense of place in a way that lots of people in cities aren't. And I think that's one of the things that's really special about being here and being from Kentucky, is we all have it. And the other thing is that Kentuckians have a sense of sarcasm and a sense of humor and a sense of irony that is sadly lacking a lot of other places.
So I know you travel a lot, but how often do you actually get back to Kentucky?
I used to get back a lot more because we were talking about this over dinner. Like my mama had 11 children, and all of them were very fruitful. And so my whole family lived in a 3-county area in Davis County and Ohio County, and I had some relatives up here. And so when my mama was alive, we were home all the time because we'd be home for family Thanksgiving and family Christmas, and we used to do things in the summer. And then that's the thing with the older generations, they sort of hold the families together. And when she died, everybody sort of petered off their own places. So now when I come home, I come home to see Aaron, or I come home to see see friends occasionally, or I'm here for weddings or funerals, and so it's.
Okay, so moving forward, can you tell us a little bit about your higher education? Where did you go to college, and what are your experiences?
So I went to college at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and I found out about it I went to the Governor's Scholars Program at UK when I was in high school, and I fell in love with a girl that summer, and she learned what I was doing. She said, well, you should come with me to Georgetown University because they have a School of Foreign Service. Like, yes, let's do that. Sadly, she didn't make it in, but I did. And it really, it was a perfect place for me because it was a place where so at Georgetown, I created my own major in ethics and international law. It was a way for me to combine my interest in human rights with my interest in international law. And then after Georgetown, we moved out to Minnesota, where I went to the University of Minnesota Law School. And the 5 years I spent in Minnesota were the longest decade of my life. And so literally the day after I graduated law school, I moved back to DC. And I moved to DC because I had started interning at the Center for International Environmental Law when I was in law school. And I did that internship, and they liked my work so much, they said, can you spend your senior year working on a book chapter for this book that we're writing? So I did that. And I was working on another book for another professor at the same time. And when I graduated law school, they said, we need you back in DC because we need you to keep working on this book. So that's what I did. And the really amazing thing was, when I finished working on the book, I would have given my IT to work at the Center for International Environmental Law. But they just didn't have any spaces, and so I had to go into private practice for what was then a very well-paid internship until I could get a job in nonprofits, and ended up coming back to CL, years and years later as the president.
Can you tell us about some of the things that you did between law school and CL?
Yeah. So, like I said, I would have been really happy to go straight into a nonprofit, and I just couldn't find a nonprofit job to save my life, and so I spent 14 months working for a big black hat law firm in DC called Covington & Burling that represents a lot of the companies that I'm now going after. And after that, I went to Defenders of Wildlife and built the international program there from just one person up to about 8 in 3 different countries, and with like a grant making program. And the great thing about Defenders was it got me working. When I was at Defenders, I was working on mahogany in Brazil and Peru, and I was working on sharks in the ocean and parrots in Mexico and in Africa. And so it gave me the chance to do all these really amazing things. Like there was one point where I was photographing illegal logging in orangutan habitat in Borneo, and I had guys threaten me with machetes, and I had an orangutan actually steal my water bottle and kiss my camera. And so, it gave me the chance to do all this amazing work, but I was convinced at Defenders that I was going to be the one guy who was not working on climate change. I was like, everybody is working on climate change. Somebody has to do something else. And then I started, looking at how climate change was affecting the species I was working to protect. And I realized that if I wasn't working on climate change, everything else that I was working to save was threatened, and all that work was going to be undone. And it was at that point that I realized, much as I might want to, focus on something else, I have to do climate change. And so it's been a big part of my life ever since.
And you worked for Greenpeace as well?
I did. And when I left Defenders to go to Greenpeace, the funny thing is, the reason I went to Greenpeace was everybody thinks of Greenpeace as people who hang banners from things and people who are going out in rubber dinghies. And that's all true. That is absolutely true. But the thing that attracted me to Greenpeace was I'd been working with them for years on illegal logging in Brazil. And I could do the lawyering. I could go through the treaties, I could go through the regulations, I could go through the laws and say, here's the case we can make based on the evidence. But it was Greenpeace who was going out and getting the evidence. Like, Greenpeace had this massive investigative arm that I had no idea that they had. And the longer I worked with them, the more I realized they had this amazing toolkit. And they also had really good lawyers. And I'm like, so I went to work for Greenpeace because I wanted to expand my toolkit. And the funny thing was, the day I walked in the door, literally the day I walked in the door at Greenpeace, it was early 2006, they said, all right, you have to plan an expedition to the Bering Sea. It runs for 2 months. It leaves in June. You're on the expedition, but you're the project manager. And I'm like, I've never been on a boat. So Greenpeace was a tough place to work, but it was this amazing exposure to all the different ways you can be effective at being an environmentalist. And then, so from Greenpeace, I took over a small nonprofit called the Climate Law and Policy Project because I was eager to start suing people. But my first day on the job there, I asked to look at the books, and they showed me the books, and I was like, you've been in existence for 3 years, you have no money. And so we had to, my whole job at that nonprofit was winding it down. And then I did consulting at Global Witness, and then I came back to CL in 2010.
So what made you feel like you were ready to make make that step to CL, or like what kind of led you to ultimately to where you are now?
I would, I wanted to come back to CL my whole life. I wanted to start there. And so when the opportunity came to actually go back as the president, it was a total no-brainer for me, and it was like coming home. And that's the thing is, CL is this weird. I haven't even said what CL is. So the Center for International Environmental Law has been around since 1989, and it was founded by 2 British barristers and 2 U.S. environmental litigators from the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, and they wanted to combine the deep understanding of international law with U.S. environmental legal advocacy, and it had never been done before. And so that's why CL was created. And it's always been sort of a niche thing. And people think that we're much larger than we are. CL is actually quite small. We have 16 staff in Washington and Geneva. But because of the way we work, because of all the interns that we work with, all the students that we work with, and how collaborative we are, people assume CL is this huge thing. It's just that we sort of have an outsized impact for an organization our size. And I mean, a lot of you are from small organizations. You know that's pretty common. Like small organizations who concentrate on doing one thing well tend to look a lot larger than they actually are.
So you mentioned that there's 16 people on staff. Are they all lawyers, or do they have all the different kinds of roles?
They're mostly lawyers, but we have, one of the things I'm proud of is I've taught a bunch of lawyers to communicate and why it's useful to actually communicate about what we're doing. So we have communications staff. We also have, we have we have campaigners too, because lawyers are decent campaigners, but a real good campaigner is an asset. So we have lawyers, campaigners, communication staff, and then support teams.
So what is your day-to-day job like? Like what kinds of tasks are on your shoulders?
Well, the big ones are the same tasks that any nonprofit leader has. I raise the money, and I pay the bills, and I keep the lights on, and put the systems in place so all these amazing people who work for CL can do their jobs really well. And then the things that are real focus for my energy are, I focus on building new things. Like what is the thing that's just over the horizon that nobody sees yet that we should be doing? And that's where our work on climate litigation came from. That's where our work on Smokin fumes, investigating the history of what the oil companies knew and when, that's where it came from. And work on what is the financing that's going into oil and gas and coal, and how can we go after that financing? Those are the pieces that really excite me. I think one of the biggest things I've been doing for the last year, in addition to the climate litigation piece, is we had a funder come to us who worked with us on toxic chemicals for a long time, and he said, what could CL do about the issue of ocean plastics? And we looked at it and we said, well, by the time the plastic is in the ocean, it's just a massive cleanup operation. So you're not going to solve the problem of ocean plastics fixing it in the ocean. And if you're looking at the waste streams, well, there are literally millions of waste streams. And so we wanted to look farther upstream. And so where do you look when you look all the way upstream on plastics? You find oil and gas. And so the thing that we've been doing for the last year is trying to highlight to people who campaign on plastics that plastics are really part of that oil and gas supply chain. And for oil and gas people, we've been highlighting that oil and gas, it ends up not only in the atmosphere, but in the oceans as plastics. And that's actually been really transformational in how we work on both of those issues together. And so one of the cool things that we're just working on now is we're going to do a life cycle human health impact report on plastics that doesn't just look at the plastics in the ocean, that says, here's the human health impacts of plastics when they're coming out of the ground as oil and gas. Here's what happens in the pipelines. Here's what happens in the refineries. And here's what happens to the people living in the shadows of these plants, like we saw with Hurricane Harvey in Houston. And it's only after the plastics have been in the food chain, only after they've been on shelves, only after they, some of them have been incinerated and released waste there, that bits and pieces of them end up in our water supply and in our oceans and in our fish as plastics. And we talk about the human health impacts there. And so when so I think that's sort of key to our approach, is always asking not only what is the narrow place where we can focus on the problem, but what's the big picture that this problem is part of.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the climate change litigation project?
Yeah. So several years ago, obviously I'm an international lawyer, and the reason I left Greenpeace was my goal was to sue governments. I wanted to sue the United States on behalf of other countries, Seychelles and the Marshall Islands, because I realized that the United States and some of the European countries, from very early on, they had scientific expertise, they had the resources to have really recognized the climate problem. And so for that reason, they deserve to be held more responsible. But a curious thing happened when I was doing that research. I came across this letter to Congress by President Johnson from 1965. This was in 2008, maybe. It was a letter from President Johnson to Congress in 1965, and he's saying to Congress, man may be contaminating the atmosphere through the combustion of fossil fuels in ways that would threaten the climate of the entire planet. Now, it wasn't at all surprising that the president would know about climate change in 1965, but what I realized, and this actually comes from having worked at Greenpeace, was if you're the leader of a company and the president of the United States is saying to Congress in writing that your product is threatening the global atmosphere, what responsible corporate leader anywhere isn't all over that? And so in the effort to understand state responsibility, I actually realized there's a whole untapped world here in understanding what these companies knew and when. For those of you who are lawyers, in products liability law, there is an assumption that anybody who brings a product to market is an expert in every aspect of that product. And it's a reasonable assumption. You're expected to know everything about it. And so I realized that there would be a period before the 1980s, an earlier period, where maybe these companies were less guarded about what they said in public about climate change. And so I went looking for that. And it took a really long time, in part because I had to learn the language of climate change from the 1900s, and then from the 1940s, and the 1950s, and the 1970s. And the language of climate change changed in all those different times. The company names changed. The problems that were being discussed, they all changed. And once you learn that language, what starts to come out is this amazing hidden story about what these companies knew and when. And when you tell people about it, when I tell people about it, they're shocked. And I understand why they're shocked, but they really shouldn't be. Because the oil and gas companies, these were companies that, and we were talking about this over dinner, when I was little, I grew up watching Beverly Hillbillies and Dallas. And so I had this conception in my head that oil guys, they were rich, they might be clever, but they weren't smart. And nothing could have been further from the truth. These companies were, from the very dawn of the 20th century, they were staffed by scientists of the highest caliber for decades. And we started to see that in the research that we were putting together. And so the real breakthrough moment for me was finding this history that the oil industry had written about its Smokin Fumes Committee. That was the real name, Smokin Fumes Committee. And it was a very proud history. The Smokin Fumes Committee was created in late 1947 when there was a particularly bad headline about smog in an LA newspaper. That afternoon, because of that headline, you had a bunch of oil industry guys come together in a hotel room and say, we have to do something about this. So they decided to pool their resources to start funding science and combining that science with active public relations campaigns to take on the government science about air pollution and to convince the public to be skeptical about that science. And if this sounds familiar, it should. And that was 1947. I was subsequently able to determine that that same committee by 1958 was researching carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a pollutant, 1958, as an industry-wide endeavor. And the way I was able to find it was I had already found a scientific paper from Humboldt oil scientists from 1957 talking about climate change, talking about the combustion of fossil fuels, CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere. Hopefully the oceans will absorb it. This was 1957. It's branded Humboldt Oil, which is now Exxon Mobil. It was their top level scientists. And they're talking about all of the names that anybody who studied climate science knows. Svante Arrhenius, Guy Callender. And not only were they engaging on the science, even in 1957, they were trying to undercut what was then the cutting edge science on the issue. This is, if you're a lawyer, this is important because that demonstrates that by 1957, this company at least was on notice of the potential climate risks associated with the products. There were still some uncertainties, but it was on notice. Now, I can't prove that the rest of them knew about it until this API report, which was the next year, 1958. And then, 1959, a scientist named Edward Teller actually specifically warned the entire API leadership about climate risks. In 1962, and we just released this just a couple of weeks ago, it wasn't just Exxon. Shell Oil, I have Shell's chief geologist warning very specifically about climate risks in great detail as part of a larger energy report in 1962. And he actually says that another scientist that he'd been in a presentation from is warning that we need to shift to solar energy rapidly. By 1968, the Smokin Fumes Committee had commissioned basically a comprehensive report from its consulting scientists on all of these air pollutants. And this report looked at a whole array of air pollutants, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, ozone. And the remarkable thing was this report talked about all those in detail, but then it added on a section and said, remarkably, what you really should be worrying about is carbon dioxide. It went through the climate science at that point, and it said there are some uncertainties, certainly, but it's clear that CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere. The basic physics of what will happen is clear. The planet could warm by 2 degrees by these dates. And the scientists said, and the best fit to the available science, it is fossil fuel combustion. The thing that appears to be causing this is fossil fuel combustion. And so the scientists said that yes, there are uncertainties, but where you should focus research now is on reducing emissions. This was 1968. This was more than 5 decades ago. So what did the industry do with that? They said, we don't like that answer. Go try again. And so the same scientists went back and they wrote a whole new supplemental report that said basically, and at greater length, the same thing. If you read it, it's clear they're under a lot of political pressure at this point. And so they throw in one paragraph, literally one paragraph, that says, yes, but there's some uncertainty, so maybe, let's not rush on this. That paragraph is all the industry ever wanted to talk about after that. And what's even more remarkable is 3 years later in 1972, the oil industry presents this massive report. It's a 2-volume report. The second volume is 300 pages long. To the Department of the Interior on all the things that the oil industry is doing to address air pollution. And in talking about air pollution, they highlight this massive study, and they say, we have these eminent scientists do this report, and here are all the things they found, except when they got to climate change. And they ignored what their own scientists had said, and went back and found an earlier report by a different group of scientists that said something different, and they put that in. And that pattern we see over and over and over again. And it's part of that pattern that explains why, when I talk about research on climate change from the 1950s and 1960s, people don't believe it. Everybody thinks that climate change is a relatively new issue, or nobody was talking about it until the 80s, or nobody was talking about it until the 90s. That's not true. It was never true. And the one group of people who we know were talking about it in the 60s and the 70s was the oil industry. And it gets really remarkable when you get to the 1980s, and you see things like Shell Oil actually calculating what its own contributions to global warming were. There's a report from 1988 where Shell actually says these are really significant problems. Here is Shell's contribution, and they say, Shell alone is responsible for 4% of all of the accumulated CO2 in the atmosphere in 1984. The remarkable thing about that is, first, it's a company acknowledging that it is responsible not only for its production processes, but for how its products are used. And even more importantly, that number that Shell calculated for itself in 1984 is remarkably similar to a number that a scientist or a researcher named Richard Heady calculated decades later. And this comes to the climate litigation piece. There's no secret that the oil companies and the coal companies funded massive climate denial operations for decades. That's a matter of public record. The real question was, well, what did they actually know when they were doing this? And we can demonstrate that they were saying one thing publicly while they knew another thing to be the case. And this is where Richard Heady's research comes into play and where it's so transformative. Richard Heady, and full disclosure, I'm now on his board because his work was awesome, so I joined his board. He's a geologist and a researcher and a very methodical guy. And so he went back and he went through corporate reports, he went through annual reports, he went through SEC filings, he went through API reports, dating back to the earliest records he's found are 1850. And he just did basic addition. And he added up, and where companies merged, he put them together, where companies split off, he allocated that, and in doing that, he was able to trace 66% of all of the CO2, all of the industrial CO2 emissions in the atmosphere to 90 entities. Now, again, if you're a lawyer, this is pretty important, because of those 90 entities, 50 were investor-owned companies. Exxon, Chevron, Shell, BP, Peabody. And while a judge can't deal with 7 billion defendants, a judge can very comfortably deal with 50. And that's what we're seeing now, is as the science of climate attribution and attributing climate impacts has gotten better, our ability to say this person has been harmed by climate change in this way has gotten much, much stronger. And now on the other end of that chain, we have the ability to say, and we can document that the CO2 came from this set of companies. And that's been truly transformative in climate litigation. And when you combine that with the evidence of what they knew and what they did with what they knew, it's led to what is now a growing wave of lawsuits against these companies, not only across the United States, but around the world. And I think when you read the headlines, it's easy to think, Exxon would like everyone to think that Exxon is just being prosecuted by the politically motivated Attorney General of New York and a bunch of hippie California cities. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that, yes, Exxon has been investigated by the Attorney General of New York, but those AG investigations have been upheld over and over, as have the investigations in Massachusetts. In New York, the AG found that Exxon, found evidence that Exxon is actually perpetuating an ongoing massive fraud on the market with respect to its climate denial. In Massachusetts, the courts found that Massachusetts had jurisdiction over Exxon because it controls the marketing of gas in the state. And the court held that if the evidence that appears to be there and that this subpoena is about actually exists, there's a good case that Exxon is in violation of consumer protection laws in Massachusetts. And those consumer protection laws are identical to the consumer protection laws in a dozen other states. And then you get the city of New York suing. And you get San Francisco and Oakland suing. And San Francisco and Oakland are suing because of rising sea levels. But if you look at the suit that Boulder, Colorado just filed, it's not about rising sea levels, it's about wildfires and drought. And if you look farther south in California and Santa Cruz, those are about wildfire and drought. And we are working on a case in the Philippines, which was the first of its kind filed against these same companies, that is investigating how Exxon and Chevron and BP and others contributed to human rights violations in the Philippines because of climate change's contribution to hurricanes and Typhoon Haiyan. And in all of these places, the science that shows that climate is making these problems worse is getting better and better. Just a week and a half ago, a new suit was filed against Shell in the Netherlands, all of which demonstrates that this litigation is only going to accelerate. And it's going to accelerate not because it's being run by a bunch of hippies in California or politically motivated prosecutors in New York. It's going to accelerate because the evidence is there, and increasingly the law is there too. When you look at any sort of litigation, there's a basic causal chain that you need. There's a basic litigation chain. You need a plaintiff with identifiable harms. You need a defendant who you can say caused those harms, and you need a causal chain between them. And increasingly, we can put all of those links in place. And that means the future for these companies is increasingly a future that is going to be characterized by ongoing litigation in the same way that tobacco companies face. The real difference between where we are on climate litigation and where we are on tobacco is that it took, if you look at the history of tobacco litigation, the first 30 years of tobacco litigation, the story was always the same. The plaintiff always loses. And what happened in tobacco was that first it was lawsuits by individual smokers or their estates, and those were just constantly lost. And then it was class action suits on behalf of smokers. Then it was class action suits on behalf of secondhand smokers who didn't contribute to their own harm in any way. And then you started getting suits by states who were trying to recapture the cost to the state government of all the health impacts of smoking. That took decades, but we're already there now on climate change. It took 30 years for a judge to recognize in a tobacco case that there was clear evidence of corporate wrongdoing. In climate, the plaintiffs are going into court with that evidence of corporate deception already in their hands and already in their briefs. And that is really a profound difference. And so when people say, oh, well, you're trying to compare this to tobacco, it's nothing like tobacco, I say, you're right, it's nothing like tobacco because we're much farther along. There's going to be a long way to go yet, but what we're seeing is not just suits by cities or by human rights bodies or by consumer protection advocates. We're seeing suits by investors who feel like they've been misled and they've lost money. And all of this is going to accelerate the shift away from fossil fuels, which is really ultimately what this is all about.
So I can't resist but ask you to talk a little bit about the tactics between tobacco and oil that you're telling me about over dinner, because as a fascinating little side story to all of us.
Okay, so sometimes you say something and it sounds like a conspiracy theory because you're just a conspiracy theorist. And sometimes it's because there's something there. In the early 2000s, Naomi Oreskes wrote this amazing book called Merchants of Doubt, where she documented not only the parallels between the climate denial campaigns of the oil, gas, and coal industries and the tobacco industries, but she documented how there were connections between them, how many of the same institutions, many of the same front groups and lawyers. And everybody inferred from that clearly the oil industry was using the tobacco industry's playbook. But like I said, the oil industry started doing this stuff in 1947. And so at one point when we were about 4.5 years into this research, I asked myself, well, were there any connections between these companies? And it was quickly we found that there were. In 1977, the chair of British American Tobacco, which was at the time the second largest tobacco company on the planet, also sat on the board of ExxonMobil. British American Tobacco alone had board members on 3 separate oil companies. But there's a much more fundamental story here. If you actually look at the economic history of the tobacco and oil industries, you find that they're really closely intertwined. Why? Because for those of you who grew up when I did, where did you go to buy cigarettes? You went to the gas station. And so for the tobacco companies, the gas stations, those were their most important retail outlet. For the gas stations, for the oil companies, cigarettes were their major retail product other than gas. And the margins were higher on the cigarettes. And so when you look into the history of these companies, you find that they're deeply connected for decades, going back to the 30s. And you can document this because of the tobacco litigation, which, as a result of the tobacco litigation, there are more than 15 million once secret tobacco company documents in a searchable database. So I went looking through that database for the names of oil companies. And it was here that it really started to get staggering. When the cigarette companies first started to investigate the toxins in tobacco smoke, they didn't have the equipment to do it. You needed mass spectrometers, and there were only a couple of businesses in the whole United States that knew how to use mass spectrometers. Those businesses were mostly oil companies. And so we have records of Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds taking their cigarettes to Humble Oil, which is now ExxonMobil, and to Shell to have it tested for toxics in their mass spectrometers. How did the oil companies respond to this? They patented cigarette filters and entered into joint ventures with the tobacco companies for the cigarette filters. All of this is much less interesting than the clear evidence that the tobacco industry conspiracy, and we can call it a conspiracy, the government has called it a conspiracy, that's what it was. It actually started years later than the oil industry's efforts in this same space. And we documented over and over and over again that in its early years, the tobacco industry looked to the oil industry for models, it looked to the oil industry for advice, and it even looked to the oil industry for people. There's this amazing memo before they even set up the Tobacco Institute, where somebody from the tobacco company is asking the medical director of Standard Oil, now ExxonMobil, for advice on friendly scientists to add to this committee. And he gives them a list and says, these are guys we can work with, this is what you'll get out of it. And if you go back and you look at the tobacco industry's list of scientific consultants years later, you see those names over and over and over again. There's a guy named Theodore Sterling who, by the tobacco industry's own admission, and by the recognition of the U.S. Department of Justice, was one of the tobacco industry's most important scientific assets for decades. And Sterling was an interesting character because he was not a medical doctor. He was a mathematician. And his whole shtick was arguing that no amount of epidemiological data will ever be enough to prove a link between smoking and cancer. It doesn't matter how good your model is, doesn't matter how good your study is, there's always going to be just too much uncertainty. And he's a mathematician, so he's very good at making this argument. He came to the tobacco industry from previous work with the oil industry, doing the same trick on lead and other air pollutants. So we see over and over again that the methods that tobacco used are similar to the methods that the oil industry used because they were developed together. They were developed hand in glove. And I think this is important when you recognize that the tobacco industry is the very poster child for corporate conspiracy. And so, am I a conspiracy theorist? Maybe. But there's sure a lot of evidence that the conspiracy is real. And I think this is where we see the cases increasingly pointing. As the evidence grows stronger, not only that the companies individually understood these risks, but they demonstrably acted in concert over and over to perpetuate the risks and to perpetuate uncertainties about climate. You know, it's not going to give rise to government action under the current administration, but it's not the sort of thing that can be ignored forever.
So I have, I guess, one more question before we open the floor for some other questions. And we started out talking about Kentucky, so I want to kind of bring it back to Kentucky and thinking about our homegrown fossil fuel coal and what role that plays in some of your international work and what you can say about, you know, the decline of coal and what that looks like for you.
So coal is complicated for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, here in the U.S., it's actually a pretty positive story, and we keep telling it. Like, if you think back to 2007, 2008, the coal industry was declaring that it was in the midst of a renaissance. That, and we're going to be building hundreds of new coal plants across the country. By 2013, all the U.S. coal majors are bankrupt. Now, clearly there are still coal plants operating. Many, they're being retired much more quickly than the industry ever pictured. But the coal industry in the U.S. is a demonstration of how quickly the economic realities can give way to change in the economy, change in technology, and change in the regulatory landscape. That is really encouraging. At the global level, for a long time, it looked a lot worse. Everybody was expecting the U.S. was very comfortable blaming China and India for dramatic growth in their coal consumption. The truth is, China is dramatically reducing its use of coal, and because it's a centralized economy, it can do it really quickly. It's not easy, but it's doing it. India is also growing more slowly than anyone anticipated. But there are places around the world where the fight against coal continues. In Eastern Europe, in South Africa, in parts of Central America, they're still fighting not only existing coal plants, but proposals for massive new ones. Australia is fighting the build-out of a massive mine that would add to the impacts of climate change by dumping massive amounts of toxic runoff into the Great Barrier Reef. So coal is still a key part of the fight worldwide, but notwithstanding that, even if you look globally, the trajectory of coal is a demonstration not only that it is feasible to transition away from fossil fuels, but that it can happen far quicker than anyone anticipates.
Thank you. So we have some time for questions.
Sure. Anybody have a question?
I'm interested in our Children's Trust. I don't know if you know about that.
I do.
And what they say is that the government knew. Their suit is opposing the U.S. government, that it knew a long time ago and it should have done something. Is that a solid enough argument, do you think?
It is. I mean, I think it's undeniable that the government knew, and we can demonstrate it. We can demonstrate it back to the 50s. And we can, there are memos from within the White House from the early 1960s. So it is clear that the government was aware of climate risks, and the U.S. government particularly. CL has been, CL's worked with our Children's Trust on that litigation quite a bit. With amicus briefs, with providing expert testimony or expert evidence. One of the things that's really noteworthy is that the oil industry had actually intervened in that case and made themselves defendants. When they thought that they could kill the case and keep it from going forward, they intervened and said, no, you have to include us, because if we're not included and if the plaintiffs won, it would be economically catastrophic for our industry. And then when the case survived the motions to dismiss and actually started to move forward to the merits, the oil industry couldn't get out fast enough. And they said, actually, we don't want to be defendants. But the real point here is that, saying that companies are responsible for their actions in no way alleviates the responsibility of governments, both to regulate those actions and, in the case of governments like the U.S., for their direct role in climate change through subsidies to the industry, through oil and gas leasing, and through active promotion of fossil fuels. And I think this is one of the things that's important to recognize about the Our Children's Trust litigation. It's not just arguing that the government failed to act to respond to climate change. They are arguing, and with good evidence, that for decades the U.S. government, even as it was aware of climate risks, has continued to promote policies that actually encourage the combustion of fossil fuels.
Sarah Lynn Cunningham, Louisville Climate Action Network, and the Kentucky Conservation Committee. The historian in me would like to know how readily discoverable are all these documents as opposed to, are people leaking them to you? And then my other question is, just as the tobacco settlement sent a lot of money for weaning farmers off of tobacco, is there any sort of a pattern on what you're asking for in damages on these kind of climate suits? And might they lead to solar panels on top of every school or something like that?
So on the first question, you can see a lot of these documents that I'm talking about. We actually, when we write reports, and we've got two of them now, one is called Smokin, Fumes, the legal and evidentiary basis for holding big oil accountable. And if you open up that report, and any footnote you click on will take you directly into the document it's talking about. And those documents, most of those we found, they were sort of hiding in plain sight. They were in the deep recesses of online archives and Google Books and Google Scholar, behind paywalls. There's a lot out there. It was technically public, but only if you were willing to look for it really hard for a really long time and knew exactly what you were looking for. There are the other category of documents that you talked about that sort of fall into our lap. And the shell, we just put out a report called A Crack in the Shell that discusses a lot of documents like that, where the documents came into the possession of someone who put them out into the public sphere. And the great thing is, information like this breeds information. The more that comes to light, the more will come to light. And those shell documents, you can also get into them online. The next challenge for us is to start putting all of these pieces into a single place so that the evidence is there. Our Smokin Fumes report was an early attempt at that, but the evidence is piling up so rapidly that we need a much bigger tool for doing it. To your second point about what do the remedies look like? The lawyer in me has to tell you that your remedy is defined by your plaintiff. What is it that the plaintiff needs? because, you know, the litigation that is going on, it needs to, ultimately you've got a plaintiff and you're trying to redress that plaintiff's harm. That being said, if you look at the Our Children's Trust litigation, you know, what they're looking for is not only massive changes in policy, but investments in alternatives. Similarly, a suit in the Netherlands 2 years ago called the Urgenda case actually forced the Netherlands government to rejigger its entire climate policy. With the suits against the companies, the relief being asked for in each case is a little different. So San Francisco and Oakland have said to their defendants, your actions contributed to sea level rise, which is creating a nuisance, which now has to be abated by all of these responsive measures. So we want you, companies, that abate this nuisance by helping pay to address the harm. But there are, you know, I'll tell you that many of the groups that do this, you know, they do this, yes, to address the harms to the plaintiffs, but we all recognize that real solutions to this are going to demand, you know, investments in something new. Investments, and not only investments in new technology, but investments in helping people transition to something new. And so I think that, you know, I think that's a key driving force behind it, to the thinking that goes into a lot of these cases. That being said, you know, if you're a city and you're suing, your goal is to protect the people of your community, and to get the resources to respond to what climate is doing to their rights and their property and their lives.
I'm wondering, Carroll, if you or your group and other groups together are beginning to find people like in the tobacco industry who knew deeply, they were deep insiders, they knew what the hell was going on. Are you at the point where you're finding some people who are stepping forward anywhere in there and saying, we know what happened and we'll help?
Yes.
Hang on, Ben. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, can I share one quick anecdote on that? Because sometimes that sharing happens inadvertently. Because of our Smokin fumes work, it prompted, somebody made a documentary about it, and I spent a bunch of time last summer traveling around with this documentary film crew doing stuff to sort of document the history of the oil industry. And one of the people that we interviewed, I had written about the history of Humble Oil's first expedition sending an oil tanker across the Arctic Ocean in 1968. And the documentary crew actually tracked down a scientist, an engineer who was on that expedition in 1968. And so we went to the site where this oil tanker was built, and we spent 2 hours like on the river in a boat, like talking and going through the history of it. And at one point I asked him, I said, you know, it's clear from the stuff that we know that the industry was already well informed about climate change at the point where this expedition took place. Did you ever hear anybody talk about it while you were on the ship? And his response was priceless. His response was, no, I don't remember anybody saying anything about climate change on that ship. Nobody said anything to me about climate change until it must have been 2 or 3 years later when we were building the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and they told me to plan for the soil warming when I was building the pipeline pads. So often, those little breakthrough moments, they can come somebody wanting to do it intentionally, they can come by somebody not really knowing that they're sharing something remarkable. And when, you know, the engineer who I interviewed, you know, he's a good guy, and he's a perfectly sweet man, and he felt like he'd done the right thing his whole life. And, he, like many in the oil industry, he said, well, nobody really knew, yes, we built this, they told us to take into account, but nobody really knew. It was all very speculative until, the 90s. And so I walked him through my research, and I have to say he was, I just watched him shatter to learn that the whole time he'd been doing this, and he's actually he's very engaged on climate change now because he worked in Alaska for decades, and he'd watched buildings and communities start to slum as the permafrost melted. And so he'd become a climate activist because he was living it. And to watch him realize that the companies he was working for knew all along, it was just heartbreaking.
Yeah, my name's Ben Evans. I'm a documentary filmmaker, actually. So I was going to ask you if somebody's doing a documentary on smoke and fumes, and thank goodness they are. So if you want to tell us what that is, I'd love to check it out.
So the documentary on smoke and fumes, it's actually called Smoke and Fumes. It aired in Germany. So there's a German version out. There's a Japanese version coming soon. There's a Norwegian version. There's not one in English yet, so they're still working to translate it into English.
That wasn't my question. But it was nice to know. So kind of a two-pronged question. One is, and it's about the sort of legal atmosphere. One is, are you concerned that that there's maybe a deliberate strategy on the part of the defendants to, through our current administration, pack the courts with, essentially rig the court system so that they can get off scot-free when it gets as far as it needs to go? And then secondly is there any kind of defense on the part of the defendants that says something like, well, everybody, if we're guilty, everybody who ever drove a car knowing that climate change was a potential reality is equally guilty, so we're no more guilty than the rest of the world.
So on November 9th of last year, the day after Donald Trump, November 9th, 2016, the day after Donald Trump was elected, I received a hand-signed, hand-dated subpoena from ExxonMobil. The date was not a coincidence. They hand-delivered it to me on November 9th, the day after Trump was elected. And I wasn't unique in that. There were about a dozen of us, people who were researchers, people who were advocates, who were subpoenaed in this massive fishing expedition by ExxonMobil designed to intimidate the people who were investigating it. And those subpoenas were actually part of ExxonMobil's effort to head off the New York Attorney's investigation and the investigation by the Massachusetts Attorney General. What we've seen, Exxon keeps losing in those cases, but it keeps fighting over and over again. I know because we were going to finally, when Exxon lost against the New York Attorney General in the most recent case, we were going to move to quash my subpoena. And before we could do it, Exxon announced that it's appealing again. So it announced that on Sunday. Exxon has launched a massive campaign of intimidation against the groups that are investigating it, against the plaintiffs themselves, including in concert with folks in Washington, D.C. One of the first of those was when the chair of the House Science Committee sent subpoenas to literally a dozen people, including nonprofits, including foundations, including journalists, all designed to silence Exxon's critics. Is Trump going to populate the courts with judges that will rule badly on this? Yes, he's moving quickly to populate the courts with judges who will rule badly on a whole array of issues that are important to society, and this is no exception. Can you remind me, your last question was, I know what your question was, is the industry fighting back and saying we're all responsible? And yes, that's been a key part of the industry's strategy all along. And this is actually a really important point. Part of the reason that climate denial has been so successful, and we see the same thing playing out now in plastics as awareness of plastics increases, is that the industry pushes this narrative that we're all responsible for climate change. And if everybody is responsible, then nobody is responsible. And it's true that each of us has some capacity to change our behavior, to change our lives, and a responsibility to reduce our impact. But if you've ever tried to do that in a serious way, you know how hard it is. You know how hard it is because you're fighting against the entire system with every little decision. And we're quite privileged in the sense that we know about the issue, we understand the issue. A lot of us have more resources than the vast majority of people. And to say to a mother who is raising 2 kids in an apartment on a single income and struggling to get them fed and get them to school and get clothes on them and get them to bed on time, to tell her that she has to take responsibility for where the power behind her light switch comes and for where every moment in her life where the energy comes from that, it's simply not fair. Not when there are companies who have had the capacity and the resources to affect this change at a far more profound scale for decades.
Well, instead of being intimidated, can you use that opportunity to testify and prior to then as a platform to get your message across?
I have to tell you that when they first announced the subpoenas from the House Science Committee, I was really hoping that I would get one of those subpoenas, because then I was going to literally give them all the documents that I had and said, yeah, here's the stuff that I've got. Instead, I'm taking those documents to the Philippines Commission on Human Rights this summer, because they want to see them. We actually have the benefit that we want what we're doing to come to public light. Exxon has, it's the height of irony, but Exxon has alleged this massive conspiracy. Like the idea that me talking to a group of attorney generals about the information that I've uncovered is somehow wrong. And I've said, I'll come and tell you, Exxon, all the stuff that I've told the attorney generals, and I tell the attorney generals all the same stuff I'm telling you. I'll tell it to anybody who'll listen. And I think that's a pretty fundamental difference between us and the industry, and it's actually a pretty powerful difference.
We'll do one more.
If this is really the last question, it's probably a perfect time to be asking it, because I'm taking, this question goes in a different direction. Everything I've read and seem to understand is that our way of raising animals in mass for food, the methane produced and other sources that produce methane probably are massive garbage heaps, etc. I'm wondering if there's how much of climate change or CO2, that sort of thing, might be attributable to that sort of thing as compared, if you look at 100% of it, as compared to the oil, gas, maybe coal industry, what chemical plants that you've been talking about. And are you, or is anyone that you know, trying to deal with that? Maybe along the same lines of what you're doing here, like, somebody's got to be responsible, ultimately, or maybe that'll be a different battle.
Well, Hank is sitting right in front of you, and he's I've got answers to this, but maybe Hank, do you want to start?
Well, I actually was going to ask you.
Okay.
Question.
Well, that's great. The answer is there are multiple drivers of climate change. the combustion of fossil fuels is the most important, but it's not the only one. There's also deforestation. There's the climate emissions that come from land clearance, and from, that's why things like no-till soil practices are important for the climate. And there are the massive methane emissions that come from, from any form of livestock management, but particularly from CAFOs and intensive livestock management. Methane is a greenhouse gas that is 20 times more powerful than CO2. And so yes, it is a really significant contributor to climate change. So much so that last November, and I ended up talking with them before they went live with it because they didn't want to get sued. But the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy actually released a big report on the meat majors that was modeled on the carbon majors research that Rikitti had done, that looked at the CO2 and the methane emissions and the greenhouse gas concentrations that were coming from the big animal growers. And so, yes, it is an important contribution. I think, and it speaks to the fact that there's no silver single bullet in responding to climate change. I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent, but you'll see why in a moment. When my oldest was little, I was still working for Defenders of Wildlife, so around things like unsustainable fisheries and climate change and invasive species and illegal wood trade. I was doing all this. And our next door neighbor, who was her best friend, her dad was a labor activist. And we got together and we couldn't eat dinner together. Because, all the things, we go to eat this and say, we can't do that because it's got this problem, this problem, this problem. And the guy who was a labor activist would say, oh, well, you can't eat those mushrooms and you can't eat those tomatoes. And I was like, why can't I eat the mushrooms? And the point I'm making is that, this goes back to the point about everybody being responsible for the problem. Yeah, I was pretty well informed on my little pieces of the problem. And he was pretty well informed on his little pieces of the problem. But asking any one consumer to be well informed on all of that and keep all of that in their mind is just patently unworkable. And so reducing your meat consumption is a really powerful way to reduce your impact on the planet. It is absolutely undeniable. And addressing CAFOs is a very climate relevant thing to do.
Okay, everybody, join me in thanking Carroll. Thanks again to our sponsors, KCC, Kentucky Cell Society, LCAN, Kentucky Resources Council, Bellarmine University, and of course, Thomas Jefferson Church. Ben, come up here real quick for me, please. Ben has a quick announcement about whether he's aware or not, about your movie being screened here, right? Is it?
Oh, yeah. What are the days? June 8th. Oh, yeah, okay. So my name's Ben Evans. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I made a film recently called Evolve, Driving a Clean Future in Coal Country. It's about electric vehicles and also about renewable energy in the state, our need to transform both of those sectors simultaneously and in concert. And it's screening here on June 8th at 8:30. And you're all invited. And please spread the word and let people know. And if you want to go see the film, you can go onto Vimeo, Vimeo on demand, and you can go get the film, like right now. You just go, it's Vimeo on demand, and then it's /Evolve Film, if you look up Evolve Film. And if that comes up with something weird that's not what you're looking for, then if you do Evolve KY, that should also bring it up. Thanks.
We plan on doing things like this in the future soon, so stay tuned for that. And again, I wanted to thank Mark for his technical support, Alan for getting this all together for us at Thomas Jefferson Church, and thank you all for coming. Have a good night. Strabo. I have a law firm here in Louisville, Strabo Barkley PLLC, and we're helping sponsor this event tonight along with the Kentucky Conservation Committee. Yay, Lane Bowman's here. I'm going to list off our other sponsors, Kentucky Solar Energy Society, Louisville Climate Action Network, okay, Kentucky Resources Council, Bellarmine University School of Environmental Studies, and of course, Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Church. And I don't think Drew is here. Is Drew Foley here yet?
His back is hurting.
Okay. Or Drew. I'm sorry, Drew. But Drew was very instrumental in helping us get this arranged in the last minute, so I want to thank Drew for that. And also the Cumberland chapter of the Sierra Club and the Louisville group of the Sierra Club. They did they helped with this as well. So tonight we're going to hear from Carroll Muffett, and Kate Bulinski is going to moderate it for us. But I think most of you probably know by now, if you've looked at the advertisement for this, that Carroll is born and raised in Kentucky. He was born in Owensboro, raised in Hancock County. So it's nice to know that we have great people in DC working for us, other than Scott Pruitt. But I'm going to start with Kate. So Dr. Kate Bulinski, she's an associate professor at Bellarmine University School of Environmental Studies. She has a PhD in geology. She got it from the University of Cincinnati, and her undergraduate degree at Penn State in geosciences. She is also the board president, current board president, right, of Kentucky Interfaith Power and Light. Most of you probably know Tim Darst in that organization. It's a great organization. I work with Kate at Bellarmine. I teach classes at Bellarmine, one class a year, not too many. But she's great with students, and she's a great educator and professional. So everyone, please welcome Kate, our moderator tonight. And now for Carroll Muffett, special guy tonight. Carroll is the CEO and president of the Center for International Environmental Law, CL. We'll let Carroll talk about CL, but prior to that, he was the executive director of the Climate Law and Policy Project. He's worked with Greenpeace USA as their deputy campaigns director, and he was international counsel and senior director for international conservation at Defenders of Wildlife. He graduated from University of Minnesota's Law School and Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He's also a member of IUCN's Commission on Environmental Law, serves on the board of advisors of the Climate Accountability Institute, and the board of editors for the International Journal of Wildlife Law and Policy. So I mentioned this before. What's so great about Carroll is that when people become angry at you that you're from Kentucky and that Scott Pruitt is from Kentucky, you can tell them just piss off. We also have someone here that more than makes up for it. So please everybody welcome Carroll Muffett. So the way this is going to work, Kate's going to basically interview Carroll and have a back and forth that way. And then towards the end, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Okay? With that, thank you all.
Well, first I want to thank you, Carroll, for agreeing to come and speak with us tonight, and thank all of you for coming tonight. So I guess in my role as an educator, I'm always very curious how people kind of come into the profession that they're interested in, because I'm always guiding students into, following their paths. So I want to hear a little bit about your background. So can you tell us a little bit what it was like growing up in Kentucky, and where you went to school, and what your education was like?
Sure, and just apologies to everybody, because I do a lot of speaking, but I'm used to talking about work, and I'm not used to talking about me, so we'll see how it goes. So I grew up, like Randy said, I was born in Owensboro, but really grew up my whole life in Hancock County. I went to South Hancock Elementary School, and then I went to Hancock County High School. And when I was 11 years old, I was watching Three's Company, and I'd always known that I was interested in world history, and I wanted to be a lawyer because Michael wanted to be a lawyer on Good Times, so I wanted to be a lawyer because he was going to be a lawyer. And I was watching, but I didn't know how to combine world history and being a lawyer. And I was watching Three's Company at 11, and Jack Tripper's brother came on, and he said, "I make $200,000 a year because I'm an international lawyer." And I said, "That's me!" I was never really interested in the $200,000 a year part, but the international lawyer, like those words together, were enough for me, and I sort of never looked back.
Great. What was your early education like in Hancock County? Did you get, what kinds of formative experiences did you have?
Well, here's the crazy thing about Hancock County, and I didn't realize, I didn't realize it until I was in D.C. and realized that D.C. doesn't have a gifted program for 40 years later, but we were sort of lucky in that Hancock County 40 years ago had gifted and talented programs, and so I got to do things like study business law in 7th grade and take classes like that, and it was a standard weird growing up way out in the country sort of childhood, and I think one of the things that really led me to being an environmentalist, a lifelong environmentalist, and is that the woods were my best friends when I was growing up. It's where I went for peace. It's where I went just to be with myself. It was the only place where I was really me, was just out walking alone in the woods. And I had my family, they hunted, they fished, and just sort of being out in the peace and the quiet is sort of part of you. And one of the things I've tried to explain to people about Kentucky, because and you see it in other places, but you don't really see it in cities, is that if you're from here, it sort of runs in your blood, and when you're not in Kentucky, you feel it as an absence. And people who only grow up in cities, only grow up on the coast, they really don't get that connection to place. And one of the great things about being from Kentucky is I go to islands in the Bering Sea where people have lived there 10,000 years, or I go to communities in the Masai Mara, and those people, they get me because they're the same way. They're tied to the land, they're tied to the sense of place in a way that lots of people in cities aren't. And I think that's one of the things that's really special about being here and being from Kentucky, is we all have it. And the other thing is that Kentuckians have a sense of sarcasm and a sense of humor and a sense of irony that is sadly lacking a lot of other places.
So I know you travel a lot, but how often do you actually get back to Kentucky?
I used to get back a lot more because we were talking about this over dinner. My mama had 11 children, and all of them were very fruitful. And so my whole family lived in a 3-county area in Davis County, Ohio County, and I had some relatives up here. And so when my mama was alive, we were home all the time because we'd be home for family Thanksgiving and family Christmas, and we used to do things in the summer. And then that's the thing with the older generations, they sort of hold the families together. And when she died, everybody sort of petered off their own places. So now when I come home, I come home to see Aaron, or I come home to see see friends occasionally, or I'm here for weddings or funerals, and so it's.
Okay, so moving forward, can you tell us a little bit about your higher education? Where did you go to college, and what are your experiences?
So I went to college at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and I found out about it I went to the Governor's Scholars Program at UK when I was in high school, and I fell in love with a girl that summer, and she learned what I was doing. She said, well, you should come with me to Georgetown University because they have a School of Foreign Service. Yes, let's do that. Sadly, she didn't make it in, but I did, and it really, it was the perfect place for me because it was a place where so at Georgetown, I created my own major in ethics and international law. It was a way for me to combine my interest in human rights with my interest in international law, and then after Georgetown, we moved out to Minnesota, where I went to the University of Minnesota Law School. And the 5 years I spent in Minnesota were the longest decade of my life. And so literally the day after I graduated law school, I moved back to DC. And I moved to DC because I had started interning at the Center for International Environmental Law when I was in law school. And I did that internship, and they liked my work so much, they said, can you spend your senior year working on a book chapter for this book that we're writing? So I did that. And I was working on another book for another professor at the same time. And when I graduated law school, they said, we need you back in DC because we need you to keep working on this book. So that's what I did. And the really amazing thing was, when I finished working on the book, I would have given my IT to work at the Center for International Environmental Law. But they just didn't have any spaces, and so I had to go into private practice for what was then a very well-paid internship until I could get a job in nonprofits, and ended up coming back to CL, years and years later as the president.
Can you tell us about some of the things that you did between law school and CL?
Yeah. So, like I said, I would have been really happy to go straight into a nonprofit, and I just couldn't find a nonprofit job to save my life, and so I spent 14 months working for a big black hat law firm in DC called Covington & Burling that represents a lot of the companies that I'm now going after. And after that, I went to Defenders of Wildlife and built the international program there from just one person up to about 8 in 3 different countries, and with like a grant making program. And the great thing about Defenders was it got me working. When I was at Defenders, I was working on mahogany in Brazil and Peru. I was working on sharks in the ocean and parrots in Mexico and in Africa. And, so it gave me the chance to do all these really amazing things. Like there was one point where I was photographing illegal logging in orangutan habitat in Borneo. And I had guys threaten me with machetes, and I had an orangutan actually steal my water bottle and kiss my camera. And so, it gave me the chance to do all this amazing work, but I was convinced at Defenders that I was going to be the one guy who was not working on climate change. I was like, everybody is working on climate change. Somebody has to do something else. And then I started, looking at how climate change was affecting the species I was working to protect. And I realized that if I wasn't working on climate change, everything else that I was working to save was